All right, guys. Like I mentioned a couple minutes ago, I'm Dan Snyder-Nerp. I'm the Terrestrial Invasive Species Manager at the Catskill Regional Invasive Species Partnership. And like Alexa mentioned, we are in part two of a couple of webinars here. The first one was focused on identifying trailside invasives and reporting them in IMAP. This one will focus more on best management practices for those invasives talked about last session. So we won't go as in-depth into identification or impacts, though I do have some of that information on the screen and we'll talk about it. There should be time after the presentation for questions. You can also put them into the chat if you like, and we'll address them when Alexa and I wrap up. Um, All right, so before we dive into the actual invasives and the management strategies for those invasives, we'll do a little bit of groundwork, just in case anyone who's on here isn't super familiar with the concept of an invasive species. Helps if we're all using the same language and the same ideas to talk about these things, because invasive, pest, weed are often used interchangeably. And we at the CRISP Prism use them all in distinctive ways. So for us, an invasive species is something that is not native to the ecosystem that you're talking about. It causes harm in some way, measurable harm to the economy, to human health, or to the environment. And this is defined by New York State Environmental Conservation Law, Title 17, Article 9, 2008. This pretty flexible definition really allows us to use the title of invasive species to like categorize and react to species that may even be native to the United States, but not necessarily to New York. And so while they're native to our country, they're still new to New York and causing harm. Like southern pine beetle is native to Florida and causing havoc in some parts of New York. Oak wilt disease is something that's really interesting, first discovered in Texas, but no one has really proven where it came from. So maybe from Texas, not native here for sure. Okay, moving on. Oops, back. There we go. So why do we care about talking about these things, invasive species, distinctly from weeds? Um, so weeds are just any species that, from our perspective, weeds are any species that you just don't want them growing where they're growing. Invasive species in particular represent a threat to New York's biodiversity and threaten aspects of human well-being, human life. Not, well, okay, the way humans interact and live in their environment. Saying they're a threat to human life is way overblown, and that's poor wording on my part. Um, Weeds do not necessarily represent a threat to New York's biodiversity, though they might. A weed could be an invasive species. It doesn't necessarily have to be. So from our perspective, things that are categorized as invasive species contribute to habitat degradation and loss through growing into monocultures and pushing out native species. Also, they can contribute to things like erosion, which can contribute to habitat degradation and things like decreased water quality. Monocultures and decreased water quality can also lead to loss of native fish and wildlife and other plants. And some invasive species can also contribute to loss of recreational opportunities, tourism income, which the Catskills depends on pretty heavily. And of course, the economic impacts of invasive species to crop damage, forest and timber damage represent very real concerns as well. So what makes an invasive species invasive biologically are unique per species, but often their characteristics overlap, and most invasive species will have some or all of these characteristics: fast growth, um, early germination and high germination rate, um, holding on to leaves later into the summer and fall than native species, rapid reproduction, phenotypic plasticity, so the ability to adapt to multiple environments, and environmental generalists. Um, so to address new invasive species, New York State funded a series of contiguous, region-focused invasive species partnerships. So the map on the right here shows all of the partnerships for regional invasive species management in New York. As you can see, every square foot of the state is covered by one of the prisms. And we're focused here in the CRISP region, the Greater Catskills area. Um, it's about 3.2, 3.3 million acres. Some prisms are smaller, some prisms are larger. Um, they're largely split between different invasive species concerns, although sometimes the borders are defined by other features, like Route 209 represents a lot of the um, southeastern border between CRISP and the Lower Hudson. And so at CRISP, our mission is to promote education, prevention, early detection, and control of invasive species to limit their impacts on the ecosystems and economies of the Catskills. Um, so you'll see that says prevention and early detection of invasive species. That's uh, really our big focus when it comes to how we address invasive species. We um, target prevention as a management method through education, and early detection through education as well, much like this uh, webinar we're having now. We really focus on these. Is it going to advance? How many did it skip? None. Okay, we really focus on something called Tier 2 invasive species. And I apologize if I have some tech trouble. My laptop seems to be running a little hot and it's going a little slowly. So at CRISP, we focus a lot on Tier 2 invasive species for our region, which is part of a categorization and prioritization scheme that all the prisms and New York State as a whole participates in, that I'll get into in detail a little later. And so in the CRISP region, we cover all or part of 7 counties: Otsego, Schoharie, Delaware, Ulster, Greene, Sullivan, and Orange counties. And here we get into the tiers that I talked about just 30 seconds ago. So within New York State and within each prism, each invasive species that's known about being in New York State or likely to be introduced to New York State in the near future is categorized by this tier system: Tier 1, 2, 3, and 4. Tier 1 means that the species is absent in that geography, whether we're talking about the whole of New York State. If it's absent from New York State, it's Tier 1. Or if it's absent from a prism, it's Tier 1 for that prism, even though that might make it Tier 2 for New York State. Tier 2 is small numbers of localized populations within the given geography that you're talking about, which means eradication is possible and usually pretty easy. Tier 2 species are really characterized by infestations that are small and relatively easy to address if they're managed quickly. Tier 3 are species that are more widespread. Usually somewhere around Tier 3 is when public awareness starts to happen. People start to recognize there's a new plant around on the roadsides or escaping into lawns, that kind of thing. And it's really unfortunate because At the prisms, we depend a lot on members of the public to recognize invasive species and report them to IMAP Invasives, which Alexa will be talking about a little later. And if tier 3 is when most people would recognize an invasive species just through, familiarity and seeing it more often, tier 3 is a lot harder to eradicate than tier 2. And then tier 4 is species that are incredibly widespread, incredibly entrenched in the region, or whatever geography you're talking about. You can use the tier system at any scale. So I mentioned we use it at the state level and the prism level, but you can think about addressing invasive species and prioritizing them based on this tier system in your town or on your property. But anyway, tier 4 is something that's so widespread and entrenched that management eradication is going to need a huge influx of resources, labor, money, time, and it's really not cost effective anymore to do mechanical or chemical treatment on that scale. Some things like biocontrols can sort of not circumnavigate, move around that labor and resources investment because they're self-sustaining on the landscape ideally, and they seek out invasive species that they're meant to target by themselves. So they cut out a lot of that labor that a tier 4 species would require. So as I mentioned, at CRISP, we mostly focus on tier 1 and tier 2 species. We spend most of our field season surveying for tier 2 species and managing the ones that we know about. Some of our time is spent with tier 3s or tier 4s based on specific projects. We have a project where we're targeting a couple of specific species, including barberry and bittersweet, which we'll talk about tonight. Within the Catskill Park campgrounds. So those campgrounds they have a lot of visitorship throughout the season, and they're very likely spots for people to accidentally pick up seeds and maybe move them around. So they're likely vectors of spread for these invasives. So we're working on reducing and eventually, hopefully, eradicating these species from the campgrounds, if not the region as a whole. All right, so we're going to get into the invasive species now. I want to say most of the invasive species that we're dealing with tonight are woody shrubs or small trees. And so much of the recommended management that I'm going to talk about today for encountering these species on trail sides is very similar, but some species have certain peculiarities and particulars about them that mean that some methods might be more or less attractive. And we're going to start tonight on the species tonight with kind of a downer, beech leaf disease. So beech leaf disease is a disease spread by a nematode that infests beech trees, and it is spreading very rapidly in New York State. So this is one that I am going to take some time to show ID with because unfortunately, the only management that we have for beech leaf disease right now is identification and reporting it through IMAP, ideally. Although you can take photos and email them to us if you like. We'll probably just put those observations in IMAP. So we really want people to be familiar with this invasive species and be able to report it. I'm sure Alexa will repeat this later on tonight, but if you're not confident in an ID for IMAP, that's okay. If you're in doubt, you can always take a picture and look it up later, but you can also take a picture, and if it's a picture like this where it's clear, it's crisp, it's in focus, and you can see the identifying characteristics of the disease or the plant or the insect or the fish, whatever species you're dealing with, just upload it. Even if you're unsure about the ID, upload it to IMAP because um, part of the wonderful thing about IMAP invasives is every single record that's uploaded to IMAP is categorized as either unconfirmed, which means um, a state expert hasn't looked at it yet and can't confirm one, like no one's confirmed one way or the other, or it's moved to confirmed ID uh, because every single record is looked at and reviewed by a state recognized taxa expert for that species. And so even if you don't know, that expert will probably know. So for things like beach leaf disease, which are relative newcomers to our area, or even things that are more common, but that might have some lookalikes, um, you can always take a picture and upload it right to IMAP. Okay, so here we have three pictures. Sorry, I ramble and go off in the weeds a little bit. Um, so here we have three pictures of early, mid, and later stages of beach leaf disease. So early on in an infestation of the nematodes, you've got beach leaf disease where you have light banding on the leaves, and you'll see it's spotty, even on the same branch. Some leaves are affected and some are seemingly not. As you get more into the moderate stages of the disease, you start to see heavy banding, this dark pattern um, between the leaf veins. And then eventually you start to see some chlorosis, you start to see some necrosis, puckering and curling. And in late stages like this, um, young leaves coming out can actually show these as well. It's not just mature leaves that can show the um, symptoms. So beach leaf disease, like I said, has been spreading pretty rapidly, 5 years since it was first detected, and it's spread from the far western tip of New York all the way out to Long Island, to the Capital Region Prism, spreading up into the Adirondacks region. It's been a really pretty rapid onslaught. And there's been a couple of large jumps where it was detected as well. So especially if you're visiting somewhere that doesn't have a recorded observation of beach leaf disease, keep your eye out. Those records in IMAP go into maps like this at the state level. Different departments, DEC, DEP, Ag and Markets, all use IMAP invasive information to target research into how to deal with species like beach leaf disease, target things for prioritizing management. The prisms all use IMAP invasives data in similar ways. All right, so a couple of more photos of different forms that these symptoms can take here for beach leaf disease. You can see the banding on light, moderate, heavier stages, twigs that are close by that show completely different stages of infection. Some leaf puckering, some chlorosis, a little bit of curling. More curling, necrosis here. And it can really happen rapidly. We were out surveying a trail in Delaware County 2 years ago, and we saw maybe a dozen trees that had this. And this year, it's literally all throughout the forest. It it happens in the blink of an eye. Even if it's an area you have never seen it before, the very next year you can see it pop up. And not just like most invasive species, like when it's one little clump, it can happen rapidly and be pretty widespread very quick. As I said, when in doubt, just take a picture and report it. Um, there's no known way to manage the disease, so knowing where it is can help target areas for specific types of research into potential ways to manage it. Known occurrences are monitored by DEC partnering agencies like the PRISMs, and are being used to research mitigation efforts. If you find it, you can take photos of the symptoms of the tree's bark and the entire tree and submit your report to IMAP Invasives. As I said, you can also email it to us if you don't have a smartphone. Although if you don't have a smartphone and you do have a computer, you can also use IMAP Invasives from your web browser. And you can report everything the same as everything you can report in the mobile app, you can also report in the browser, and you can also report way more detail in the browser if you'd like. We won't be getting too much into the details of the browser tonight, mostly the mobile app, but it's good to just take a look around the browser as well. All right, moving away from the depressing reality of beech leaf disease, we come to Oriental bittersweet, an incredibly common invasive vine, twines around trees and girdles them pretty effectively, killing the trees. Eventually, the weight of the woody vine from bittersweet can actually contribute to like early collapse of the dead trees. It also grows very, very thickly and can shade out plants that are beneath whatever it's twining around. Birds eat the berries. They don't get a lot of nutrition from it. Birds can also contribute to spreading Oriental bittersweet through eating and moving the berries around. Bittersweet can spread through seed. It can also spread through root fragmentation, so that's relevant for some of the management that we're going to be talking about. And it can hybridize with the Native American bittersweet. I'm not going to be getting too much into ID, but I will show the American bittersweet so you know what to look out for before you start managing. As far as managing Oriental bittersweet on a trailside situation specifically, depending on who owns the trail and the trailside, mechanical might be preferred. It does respond pretty well to mechanical treatment if you are willing to come back for a couple of years, and if you're willing to do some mildly thorough hand digging and root grubbing, which just means digging up the roots and trying to get as much of the root as possible. So if you can only cut Oriental bittersweet, that's fine. That can be effective. You do need to be able to commit to cutting it often. Usually you would want to go back and cut it before it really starts twining around whatever tree it was up. And before that, you would want to just cut it back. Between the roots and the rest of the climbing vine, you want to leave like a 2 to 5 foot distance, just so it has less to twine up around as it regrows. And then again, come back every year and, or more frequently than that, and cut it before it really starts getting a new hold on and starting to twine around again. When you're cutting it back, you can follow that with repeat cutting or hand digging. We do a lot of root grubbing and hand digging for Oriental bittersweet at the campgrounds. It's not too bad, honestly. And we see really, really effective population suppression with that method. I would say bring a drain spade. You don't have to dig down that deep to get most of the roots out, and then the next year you come back, you'll just have little sprouts coming up from the root fragments, and they will help you target the root fragments that you missed in your first year, and you can dig those up pretty easily. Chemically, for Oriental bittersweet, I would really recommend cut stump, which means cutting it back and applying a chemical to the cut stump, so the chemical is absorbed and goes down into the roots, killing the roots. I like this method because it limits off-target impacts of the chemical that you're using. So the chemical just goes on the stump. You're not spraying it all over the leaves and risking getting it on things that the leaves are growing on top of. You're also making sure that as much of the chemical as possible is absorbed like into the roots itself. So again, you're not risking much of the chemical like getting onto the soil and going to waste or potentially impacting something that you're not meaning it to. And with cut stump, of course, with any time we're using chemicals, we have to think about what else uses this plant that we're putting poison into. Birds will feed on Oriental bittersweet, and so cut stump application means that the chemical is completely separate from the vine where the berries are going to be. And you don't have to worry about the chemical being moved into the fruit and affecting birds or potentially the flowers and impacting pollinators. If you want to use something like a foliar application for bittersweet, there are ways to mitigate the risks that I just talked about. Timing windows during the times of year when it's not flowering and not making fruit, decrease the risks to pollinators and birds. And if you time your applications of foliar spraying to when it's less windy, you can also reduce the risk of drift, so the chemical like being moved by the wind midair onto other things. For Oriental bittersweet, in particular for cut stump, fall timing is really the ideal, but it's an effective way to kill bittersweet and can be done any time of year. It's maybe a little less effective in winter. And for Oriental bittersweet that isn't climbing completely up a tree like in this photo we see here, goats can be effective. So early infestations of bittersweet, goats will mow down. As with any time you use goats, you really do have to commit to following up the goats with something else or bringing the goats back next year. But they're a fun, effective way to manage bittersweet. Okay. So I also wanted to show a native lookalike that I mentioned a little bit ago, the American bittersweet. So the easiest way to tell them apart is when they're bearing fruit. The native has these yellow-orange fruit, and the invasive Oriental bittersweet has red fruit. They also, the fruit form differently in different cluster formations, and the leaves are a little more narrow and more sharply pointed on American bittersweet, although there is variability in the leaf shape. Okay, and here is a map of data for Oriental bittersweet in IMAP Invasives. If you go to the IMAP Invasives website, you can see this data right now. You don't even need, well, so the pink data is unconfirmed. To see that, you do need an account. But you can see all the green dots and the green polygons, which are the like, this funny thing over here, this like loop. You can see all the green data without an account. You can just go to the website, go to the map, and type in Oriental bittersweet, and it'll show up. So this, if you're not familiar with looking at aerial views and maps and stuff, this is the majority of the Catskill Park. I'm presenting from right over here in between Kingston and Woodstock. The Catskill Center is over in this area. The visitor center is right here. I recognize that big old clump of bittersweet. Kenneth Wilson State Park is right there. So you can see bittersweet is throughout the region. There are pretty large chunks of the region where it's not reported. That doesn't mean it's not there. Um, IMAP invasives only recently introduced the ability to report a particular invasive species as not detected. So just because there isn't a green or pink dot doesn't mean that that invasive species isn't there. It just means um, it isn't reported there. Um, and you can toggle on and off non-detection areas as well in IMAP invasives. All this data is available for public viewing. Um, and so the widespread nature and some of these infestations are really big. I do want to say um, this like mass of dots here is just because we've revisited Kenneth Wilson State Campground a lot over 4 or 5 years now, and um, many of these are just, we're reporting that it's still there. I don't think this map was filtered to just show what was reported in the past year or two. So this is like 10 years or more of data for Oriental bittersweet. And so it's not like the whole area is covered in Oriental bittersweet and you can't walk anywhere. It's just overlapping like the same infestation, just repeatedly reported in multiple years. All right, I think I got to pick up the pace a little bit. Um, Japanese barberry, another very common invasive shrub throughout New York and throughout the crisp prism. Um, Not going to get too into ID, but it does have some really characteristic teardrop-shaped leaves and pretty characteristic spines. Very thin, very straight, um, pretty hard to confuse it with like a rose or something like that. Before we get into any management or anything, if you're doing any work near Barberry or hiking through or near Barberry, do tick checks. Ticks are really no joke. Anecdotally, for me this year, haven't I've been pretty lucky with the ticks this year, but I know a lot of people where that's not the case. Really do tick checks if you're working near Barberry because there's higher tick populations, and those tick populations have a higher prevalence of things like Lyme disease when they're um, nesting under Barberry in particular. Okay, I'm not going to go through all of the um, background on this species because we went over it in the last session, but it is still up here if you want to read it while I'm talking. As far as management goes, I'd really recommend cutting back the above ground stems before you go after it mechanically. And by mechanically, I just mean like with a shovel. Um, I'll also say if you have something like a weed wrench, which is like a giant clamp or vise that you can settle on a stump of a plant, and it's got a big plate that braces it against the ground, and then you can like, it's got a giant lever arm that you can like haul on and loosen the roots. Those work really, really well with Japanese barberry. Even though it's a multi-stemmed shrub, the vise can still like clump them up and get a good grip, and you can really get in there and loosen the roots up if you have a weed wrench. Um, we hand dig Japanese barberry up every year in select spots, the campgrounds, like I mentioned. Um, it can be pretty tough. Mature Japanese barberry can be pretty entrenched. It's a big labor task, but it does work really well. If you can dig up the roots uh, and be like even moderately thorough, you really don't have to worry that much. You might have to revisit for a couple of years, but and then there's, of course, with any invasive plant, there's the seed bank that you also have to combat. The seed bank is just the existing seeds in the soil from previous years that already dropped and have not germinated yet and are still able to germinate. So if you remove a Japanese barberry, you're increasing light uh, and water hitting the soil, which will trigger some seeds to germinate, and so you'll have new seedlings for Japanese barberry coming up. But hand digging really does work very well with barberry. As far as chemical applications, cut stump method, that it's honestly cut stump and hack and squirt for larger trees, which is like cut stump, but instead of cutting the whole trunk down with hack and squirt, you cut little slivers into the trunk and you put pesticide into the little slivers that you cut out. I love these because they limit off-target impacts so well. Foliar spray is just, to me, seems so much more risky than this method, but both are effective. And with barberry, it's just important to avoid foliar applications when you're seeing them flower or developing fruits, just to limit those potential impacts to things that make use of the flowers or fruit. With barberry, goats also work really well. It sounds shocking because they're spined, but goats don't care. Goats will go after it. I should have mentioned it when we were talking about bittersweet, but for goats, you need like a fence or to like chain them in to the area to make sure they'll be where the barberry is. With goats, you also want to be okay with like whatever is in there with the goats is gonna be eaten. So if you have barberry growing next to a shrub that you want to keep, you should really consider other methods before you bring the goats in because they will damage or or they'll browse anything. Um, Weed torches have also been reported as being very effective on Japanese barberry. I think maybe they're most effective when the ground is really rocky, because I've heard other people talk about using weed torches to like burn the stumps of barberry and really not seeing a lot of impact on the population the next year. But it is an option to consider. Again, there are some reports of success with it. Not advancing. There we go. Okay. So another map very similar to the Oriental Bittersweet map, maybe a little more scary. The dots are more widespread. There's more reported. Um, Again, those pink dots are not detected. They are just unconfirmed reports. And you can see those similar clusters where the CRISP team has gone out multiple years in a row and surveyed for it and done management. Yeah, it's extremely widespread. You can see it likes to follow roads. Here's along 28. If we zoomed out and got more of 209, we'd of course see it all the way down there, Route 17. It's a big roadside invader in the same way that bittersweet is. It was also really widely planted as an ornamental, and so it was also introduced to forest interiors a lot when these wooded cabins would plant barberry as an ornamental around them, and then those were abandoned or sold off to like now the state owns them, but the barberry was still there and has been slowly spreading out, which in part contributes to the just ridiculously widespread nature of barberry in our region. Moving on to Morrow's honeysuckle, but really all the bushy honeysuckles, the invasive bush honeysuckles are pretty similar and worthy of reporting and managing. This is another shrub. So most of the management methods that applied to Japanese barberry also apply to honeysuckle, Morrow's, Tartarian, Bell's, honeysuckle, different species. So yeah, cut back the above ground stems. and then hand dig the roots up. Works pretty well. I will say you might see a lot more root sprouting with honeysuckle than you might with barberry. So you may want to be a little more thorough when you're digging up honeysuckles. Um, Chemical treatment, it's the same considerations, so I won't go too deeply into that. Goats work really wonderfully on honeysuckles, but I would not really recommend using weed torches on honeysuckle. That's not to say they wouldn't work, but I have read and heard from others that I have to plug my laptop in, which does tend to make it overheat. I hope we're still going to be good for the rest of this presentation. Um, I've heard that the honeysuckle's response to fire is pretty aggressive, uh, stump sprouting and root sprouting. Um, so it won't be as straightforward as in other cases. You'll want to combine it with other methods, or just know that you'll have to repeatedly treat it several seasons in a row. Okay, just moving on to the other honeysuckles, Tartarian and Bell's. With Bell's is a hybrid between Maros and Tartarian honeysuckles. And you can see the leaves are pretty similar. The flowers are pretty distinct between Maros and Tartarian in the picture here, but um, Bell's does make things a little confusing because Bell's also has, as a hybrid, it has a lot of variability. And if you are worried about potentially affecting a native honeysuckle, look at the pith. I think there was a picture on the previous one. Yeah, look at the cut into one of the stems and look at the pith right here, the center area. All the invasive honeysuckles that we have in the Catskills have hollow pith, and the natives do not. All right. Honeysuckle is another case of a very, very widespread invasive species. It's tough to really narrow down to the species level for the honeysuckles, Tartarian, Bell's, or Maros honeysuckles, because a lot of people aren't familiar enough with them to make that determination in the field. And they take a picture, and maybe that picture isn't good enough to ID it to species. So another option when you're reporting it in IMAP invasives is just to say Lonicera, which is the genus for honeysuckles, Lonicera species unknown. So we know it's a honeysuckle, but we don't know which one it is. Those reports also show up in IMAP invasives. And you can see this is another very widespread one throughout the region. Autumn olive is one that we've really been seeing get a strong foothold and spread and proliferate pretty rapidly in the last 5-6 years. When I first came to the region about a decade ago, autumn olive was present, but didn't seem to be doing a lot of escaping and creating thick monocultures. It definitely is doing that now. All right, so with autumn olive, again, a lot of similar considerations, but with mechanical methods like cutting it back and trying to hand dig it up, it has really, really aggressive root sprouting tendencies. So it's tough to recommend trying to hand dig it up or just cutting it back repeatedly year after year. It can work. Removing the plant from the soil will tend to eventually kill it. But this one it's a taller order than anything we've talked about so far previously. For autumn olive, chemical methods work really well. Cut stump method is, again, the favorite of mine here. Limits that are off-target impact. Fall application is the best. just because that's when it's drawing nutrients back into the roots, and so it'll move more of that pesticide into the root system as well. Um, but it's likely that you will have to, even with cut stump applications, you'll have to repeat the treatments for a couple of years. For foliar applications, for this species, sort of unlike barberry, which can but doesn't tend to grow among other things, autumn olive will really happily grow intertwined with other things, mostly other invasives, but um, foliar application is when you have like some sort of broadcast, like a spray bottle, um, when you're pushing the pesticide into the air and the droplets hit the leaves and are absorbed through the leaves. Um, so foliar applications can be kind of tricky with things like vines that are growing over top of other things, or things like autumn olive, which will frequently grow among other things, just because it's hard to be very like surgical with your spray droplet applications. Um, but it is still effective at killing autumn olive in that application method as well. This is another species where goats will munch it, so goats can work uh, very happily on autumn olive. So here are the reports for autumn olive in the uh, Catskills Park. You'll see there is a lot less of it than honeysuckle or barberry or even bittersweet. Um, it's drastically underreported, um, which means it's out there. It's just not being reported to the IMAP system when people see it. That kind of a data gap between the situation in the real world and the situation as represented in IMAP is just something that the state and all invasive species managers that use IMAP have to grapple with. Just familiarity with your region and with the species can inform that. So even though from this map, we would think that autumn olive is maybe not that big a deal region-wide, I see it everywhere. It's drastically underreported. And the situation is likely more similar to the maps that we've seen previously. Multiflora rose, another multi-stemmed shrub, um, just like Japanese barberry, um, thorned, um, slightly different thorns, recurved barbs on multiflora rose as opposed to the very straight, thin barbs on barberry. Um, this is another one that likes to arc and grow among other species. So foliar applications should really be um, uh, weighed heavily before going with them if they are growing among other things, especially native species. Um, Cut stump method, very effective. Hand digging can work very well. Um, we do have native roses, so I'll just mention in particular, if you want to be sure of your ID for rose, look at the petiole where the leaf meets the stem, and if it's got little hairy fringes there at the base of it, you know you've got multiflora rose for sure. Weed torches are another good option for multiflora rose, but it'll probably need to be repeated. It's a little bit deeper of a root than some of the other things we've talked about today. Um, so if you're going to be using a weed torch on multiflora rose, um, just know that it's a case where you'll want to combine it with some other method or just repeat it the next year when you get that regrowth. I should have been mentioning it this whole time, but for uh, autumn olive, for barberry, for bittersweet, for multiflora rose, for the honeysuckles, those weed wrenches I mentioned at the beginning work really, really well to loosen those roots up and make them much, much easier to dig up and remove from the soil. Okay. Here is the map of multiflora rose throughout the region. Again, underreported, despite how widespread and how many dots we're seeing here. Underreported throughout the whole region. Um, and I'll take a second here. I know I'm going so slow, and I apologize, Alexa, for making you maybe need to rush at the end. But just because a species is widespread through the region like this doesn't mean it's not worth treating. Um, at a local scale, something could be easily be tier 2 at a town level, even though it's a tier 4, like very widespread through the region. And so it could be pretty straightforward to remove that invasive plant from that town completely, even though uh, if you look at the 3.3 million acres of the crisp region, it's incredibly common. Like I said, we do target Japanese barberry and Oriental bittersweet at the state campgrounds within the Catskill Park. These are tier 4 species that are just incredibly widespread, but because of the specific nature of visitorship that we have at the campgrounds, it's still worth treating them there. All right, border privet, another invasive shrub, um, grows pretty dense, has that thick shade that we talked about with bittersweet. Um, Another one where the weed wrench can really help to remove as much of the roots as possible. Although this one also has really aggressive resprouting. Um, so thoroughness is key. I'd say it maybe limit hand digging to smaller, newer infestations. Um, Pesticides work very well on border privet, just as with every other shrub or small tree that we've talked about today. And because of that aggressive resprouting behavior of border privet, both goats and weed torches may need to be repeated frequently, even in the same growing season. It's with this one in particular, it's so aggressive, you may not even uh, it may not be a case of coming back the next year, but coming back in the same season to treat it before it can really resprout enough to start building up its uh, root resources again. All right, this is another case of a species that is likely very underreported. But as you can see, according to IMAPs, we don't have a lot of border privet that's known about in the Catskill Park. This makes it particularly important to treat it when you find it, especially in areas where you do know that it's not, like it's definitely not present, other than a couple of small infestations. If we zoomed out to the crisp region as a whole, we would see a number of other border privet infestations. So just because there's 5 confirmed and just a couple of pink areas, um, uh, it is more widespread than the map indicates through the region as a whole. And then we come to Japanese stiltgrass. Um, Japanese stiltgrass is usually a like forest edge field, uh, mowed field invader. Um, Although with things like emerald ash borer ripping through the forests and killing off all the ash trees and opening up so much sunlight availability to the soil, we do see a lot of stiltgrass moving into the forest interior with all that sunlight availability all of a sudden. Um, for management of Japanese stiltgrass, it has extremely shallow roots. It's very easy to hand pull. Smaller infestations can be dealt with very quickly. And if you're going to use some form of powered system for cutting it, string trimmers are a little better than mowing, just because you can get closer to the ground with string trimmers. Remove more of the plant, remove some of the roots. And timing wise for stiltgrass, If you're going to be mowing or string trimming, you want to plan to come back and do that repeatedly through the season. You don't want to let it resprout and then go to seed. For grass and like most invasive grasses, pre-emergent herbicides can work really, really well. They target newly germinating seeds, not existing plants. So for something like Japanese stiltgrass, that's pretty ideal. Pre-emergent herbicides aren't going to affect things that are already growing and just dormant for the winter. They only affect seeds that are waiting to germinate. Foliar applications can work really, really well for this grass as well. Late summer is the best time. Weed torches also work really well. This is an extremely shallowly rooted plant, and so the weed torches just burn it up really rapidly. And just a quick picture of the dead mats of Japanese stiltgrass that can happen when an infestation is gone unmanaged for a while. And the reports of Japanese stiltgrass throughout our region. Japanese stiltgrass is a really, really easy one for people to pick seeds up on their boots as they're hiking, especially um, late, like late summer into fall season. So if this one's at trailheads, it's particularly important to jump on it early and remove it before all that traffic through an area or dogs moving through an area can pick them up and move them. Anytime you're working with invasive species, um, it's important to be aware of how you might also be contributing to the spread of invasives yourself, even though you're managing them. Like with stiltgrass, you're pulling up an infestation, but you could be picking up the seeds on your boots and the mud that your boots are picking up, and then accidentally moving it yourself. So if you see stations like this with this boot brush here on this gravel pit, you can brush your shoes off, like brush the mud off your shoes right in here. Those seeds will fall into this gravel pit. You can also use little tools like this with these soil picks and these brushes to remove soil from your boots before you leave an area, before you go to a new area. You do the same with any gear you're using, shovels that you've been using. If you brought mobile equipment in, check the tires and do the same with your pets. I saw we had a couple of questions in the chat, so I will address them really quickly. Just two, it looks like. DEC indicates that laying branches with rose rust on uninfected plants does this work? Uh, so, uh, yeah, rose rosette disease is a disease of all roses. It's lethal on all roses. It can be a very, it, I don't know that I'd recommend it as a treatment for multiflora rose just because, um, again, it is lethal to all rose plants. So ornamental roses that people plant in their gardens, native roses that might be growing nearby, I would be hesitant to move it and potentially introduce it to an area where it is not yet there. I found Clematis terniflora. I could not find it in IMAP under Sweet Autumn Clematis. How do you enter? You should be able to put in, so actually there's two considerations here. If you go to the browser, you should be able to enter it with the scientific name or the common name. And if you go to if you're using the app, you can actually go into the preferences section and swap to, if you're not seeing it under a particular common name, you can swap in your preferences, swap to scientific name, and you'll certainly find it there. Um, all right, any other questions I think we'll leave to the end after Alexa takes over for the IMAP portion.
So if there are other questions, I'm happy to continue answering questions before moving over into the IMAPS portion. And I was just myself looking in the IMAP species list, and I don't see sweet autumn clematis as a common name, but I do see it listed under the scientific name. So you should be able to switch to Latin names and see it there. Before I begin, are there any other questions for Dan that you'd like to ask now before we move into the IMAP invasives portion? Feel free to unmute yourself or type it in the chat. Okay, so I'm going to move on with the IMAPS portion. If you have questions, though, at any point, feel free to drop them in the chat, and either Dan or I will answer them as we see them. So if you didn't attend our first presentation and haven't learned about IMAP invasives yet, this is a great chance to get familiar with it. Early in the discussion, I'll redrop, and if that's a verb, I'll redrop in the link in the chat to the IMAP invasives account setup. If you don't have one yet, you can create an account at the link I sent, and then you can use IMAP invasives either on the computer, on a browser, or as a smartphone app. And you can go ahead to the next slide, Dan. So IMAP Invasives is a community science database. It's map-based, so it'll show species distributions and numbers throughout New York State. It's actually used throughout North America, and here in New York State, the primary partners are the New York Natural Heritage Program, the DEC, the Partnerships for Regional Invasive Species Management, and Cornell Cooperative Extension. It's helpful for us for a few different reasons. First, when people like you make reports on IMAP invasives, they're sent to the partners in certain regions. So for the Catskills, they'll be sent to us at CRISP. That gives us alerts when there's like an early detection of a new species or the spread of a new species. And it also helps us track our control efforts and results. So as we do these management projects throughout the Catskills, of course, we do our best to monitor and see how things evolve once our treatment's complete. But if we're in a campground or a state park, for example, there are so many visitors that could go in and take photos and provide us with updates on what things look like when we're not able to be there. You can move on to the next slide. So IMAPS pulls data from a bunch of different sources. The very most important one is you. So IMAPS users who are uploading either in the browser or in the mobile app give us like the quickest alerts for any invasives uploaded. Different organizations also bulk upload data. So as these groups collect data on the presence of invasive species or absence in their area, at the end of a season, they might bulk upload that data. I don't know that that's on here, but I know that IMAPS now also works with iNaturalist, but that's another bulk upload. So if when I've been running these trainings, I've met a lot of folks who use iNaturalist instead of IMAPS. That data will eventually get to us, but it won't come until the end of the season. So if possible, especially if you know you're seeing a new species or seeing it in a new area, uploading directly to IMAPS gives us the quickest alerts.
If I can jump in really quick, Alexa,
Hmm.
I wanted to also say the bulk upload stuff uh, isn't just new data that's collected that year. It also represented historical and archival data being digitized and uploaded to it. So there's 50-year-old data in IMAP invasives um, uh, just from historical records. And also the iNaturalist stuff, even though it's not integrated into the IMAP database, there's concerns about the different forms of confirming species. You know, iNaturalist has the community supported research grade stuff, and IMAP uses state taxa experts to confirm a species. So they're not like integrated into each other. You can view iNaturalist data live on the browser now. I think you might need an account, like so you log into the map, but on the right side, when you go into the browser, you can turn on different layers, and iNaturalist data is one of those. It's just represented visually and not part of the searchable IMAP database.
That's super helpful. Thank you. And you can move on to the next slide whenever you're ready. So now the slides are going to walk through the account setup. I'm going to kind of fly through this. If you have specific questions about account setup or troubleshooting, feel free to send me an email afterward. But for the sake of time, we're just going to move through it kind of quickly. The link that I dropped in the chat will bring you to the account creation page. The New York IMAP Invasives homepage looks like this, and in the upper right-hand corner is where you can log in. And you can move on to the next slide. And when you sign up, it's just like signing up for any social media account. It's not social media, but it's very similar. So you'll sign up with your name, email, set up a password, and then it'll also ask you to select your jurisdiction. That's the area that you'll be reporting to. So if you continue through the slides, I think we have a screenshot. Yeah, so it'll say New York, and then click join. So this is what the IMAP's browser page
Sorry,
looks.
I thought I jumped ahead. Sorry.
No, that's okay. Um, so this is what the browser map looks like. So if you're opening this up on your computer, and you'll see there's nationwide data, which is really cool. And then if you continue through the slides, I think it'll zoom into New York State. Maybe not. So on the left-hand side, I'll go through some of the features that you'll see on the page. On the left-hand side are buttons very similar to what you'd find in like Google Maps, zooming in, zooming out, setting a home, searching for a location. At the very top, there are action tools. So if if you want to create a record, like you have a picture you took that you'd like to upload, if you're looking for a specific record, if you want to filter based on records, and I think, Dan, is that where you can search by like iNaturalist data?
So if you go to the layers on off here,
Oh,
that's where you can turn on the iNaturalist data, but I think you might need to be logged in. The filter records should also work on that as well. Um, so if you have both the IMAP database and the iNaturalist database turned on, and you use the filter records to drill down to one or a couple species, both should be filtered. It will probably just take a while because it's filtering a lot of data.
perfect. Thank you. Um, And you can also export the results or create a report of the data, however you've decided to drill it down. Um, the geographic layers on the right, changing the base map just changes it from like a static image map like this, which is satellite view with roads, um, You can also add in layers if you have your own data you'd like to add in. Layers on and off is what Dan was just mentioning. I think, does it, I don't think if we continue on, there's a screenshot with the layers on/off expanded. That's okay. We can move on to this slide actually. So the IMAP platform is great on the web. It's really useful if you're looking for information or if you have some images on your computer you'd like to upload and create records directly. What's nice is the mobile app is really helpful for creating new records because it doesn't require connectivity, and a lot of times we're working in areas where there's no cell service. So if you have the app downloaded and your account set up beforehand, you can make sure you have like the species list downloaded, and without connecting to the internet, you can create a bunch of records. And when you reconnect to cell service or Wi-Fi, you can go back in and upload those. And we can move on to the next one. So if you haven't already, if you go to the App Store or the Google Play Store, you can download the IMAP Invasives app. We'll move on to the next slide. So some helpful tips. Good photos are essential. As Dan mentioned, our records are reviewed by experts who will identify the species. If the photo isn't good, though, it's really hard for them to confirm or deny that whatever you've uploaded is correct. One tip that I've found is helpful, similar to the photo on the slide here, is putting your hand behind whatever you're taking a photo of. It needs to be focused and it needs to be close up enough to see the details the person reviewing it needs to see in order to identify the species. If you carry a notebook, that's also really helpful if you have like a plain white sheet of paper to put behind whatever you're taking a photo of. And you can move on to the next slide. Okay. So just as a reminder, so you do need connectivity to set up the account in the app. You don't need connectivity to record the species. So to take the photo and put the information in on the app. But then you do need to eventually go back in and choose upload to actually upload that record to the database. And we'll go through that in a couple slides. It'll be a little bit more clear. You can move on to the next slide. Okay, so if you do have the mobile app and you haven't set it up yet, we'll quickly go through how to set it up. On the app itself, in the top left corner, you'll click on, it's called a hamburger menu. If you didn't know that, fun fact, because it looks like a little hamburger. So you'll click on the hamburger menu in the upper left, and the setup will open up where it'll ask you for your jurisdiction species list. So unless you're not in New York State, you'll choose New York. And then you'll enter in your email and password you created when you set up the account on your computer. And we can move to the next slide. I've found I've set up IMAPs on a few different phones now, and I've found that being connected to Wi-Fi is really helpful because retrieving the IMAP lists, it seems pretty data intensive. So if you try to set this up and you have spotty cell service, try connecting to Wi-Fi or waiting until you get better service. When you enter the species list and you retrieve the IMAPs list, you'll get a pop-up with this fun green font that will tell you that it worked okay. And you can go to the next one. So now that you've downloaded this species list and logged in, here's where you can choose if you'd like to look at the species by scientific or common name. And you can switch back and forth. You just have to go back into your settings. So like with the example of the clematis earlier, it wasn't listed under the common name the person was familiar with, so they could go into the settings and change it to the scientific name just to make that record. Picture quality, you can put it at 100% if you'd like, but it is data intensive, so I find that 50% picture quality is usually fine. And then for the base map type, I keep it on a road map just because sometimes it's helpful for me to have waypoints to see exactly where I am, if for some reason it's not correctly identifying my location. And we can move on to the next one. And important reminder to click save at the bottom. Okay, and we'll move on to the next slide. So if you have the app open on your phone, to add an observation, you'll click the green button in the upper right corner that says Add Observation. And then from here, you can either take a photo with your camera, or if you took a photo in the past and you'd like to just upload it, you can select it from your camera library. What's really cool is most smartphones now have a location tag attached to each photo. So let's say you're out on a hike and you took a photo of something that you found out later was an invasive species and you'd like to upload it. You can, when you're sitting at home, go into the app and add an observation and upload that photo to the library, and it should automatically move the location to wherever you took the photo. So you shouldn't need to go back and like figure out exactly on where you were on the trail. Some older phones, or if you have that setting turned off, won't do that. So I find it's helpful just to make the record when you're like at the location of where you're taking the photo. But if needed, you can always upload it after, and it's nice that this feature is included. We can move to the next one. So next, once you've taken the photo and you have a decent idea of what it is, you can click on the species list where it says none selected. If you're doing this like alongside the presentation right now, the very top option is a fake species. And then you have the option to determine if the species was detected or not detected. Species absence records are just as important as species detected records, especially if you're frequenting an area a lot. Beach leaf disease is a good example of this. There's a walking trail that I go on pretty frequently, and as Dan mentioned, like 2 years ago, maybe it was last year, there were like one or two trees that had beach leaf disease, and I made those records, but farther down the trail, there were no trees with beach leaf disease. So I made a record and put species not detected. And then this year, as I've been walking, I've noticed that the extent of beach leaf disease has spread. So that way we have the information to kind of show the extent of the spread and the timing of it. You can click the next slide. So if you're not connected to the internet, the map won't show up. If you're taking the photo right where you're standing, or if the photo has the location tag on it, the GPS or the map should automatically update to the correct location. If it's not, you can, like similar to Google Maps, like use your fingers to find the location and add a pin to your best guess. But the location of the record is really important. So if you're able to, I always suggest making the record in the field when you're there taking the photo rather than afterward to be sure that you have the correct location. We can move on to the next slide. And we can keep going past this one too. Lovely. Okay. So If you've made the record on your phone and you've clicked save, when you get back to the home screen, you'll notice that the record is there highlighted in yellow. This means that you've entered the data and it's ready to upload. When you're back connected to cell service or Wi-Fi, you can click the checkbox circled in red in that first image. Then you'll click the hamburger menu in the upper left and click Upload Selected, and then click OK, and it'll upload to the database.
I'll just mention here, if you take a lot of observations, you may want to don't use if you take a lot of observations, don't use the select all option. Like click 8 or 10 at a time and then upload those and then take like the next 10 because this data can be really data intensive to upload, and it will take a long time or even time out if you try to upload a bunch. We ran into this problem first 5 or 6 years ago, and I think it is still unfortunately a limitation of the app and the type of data that we're uploading.
Awesome. So I know it's not the easiest to like follow along with the presentation and try to set up an app at the same time. So if you have any questions at all, feel free to reach out to myself or Dan, and we're happy to walk you through it or provide you with the instructions or answer questions you might have. Um, and at this point, are there any other questions for Dan or I? Okay, well, both of our emails are listed on that final slide, so feel free to write them down or take a picture. We've also recorded the presentation, so if you need a transcript of the call and weren't able to enable captions, just reach out to one of us and we'll make sure it gets to you. Is there anything else you'd like to add before we sign off, Dan?
Just want to say thank you to folks for coming out tonight and watching the presentation. Um, Thanks for the good questions we had. And I look forward to seeing you guys upload all sorts of new invasive species data to IMAP.
Yes, thanks everyone. Have a great night.